In the ancient ruins of Eridu, beneath the layers of sand and millennia of accumulated debris, archaeologists uncovered fragments of what may be humanity's first written account of global catastrophe, dating to approximately 2100 before the Common Era, though clearly based on far older oral traditions. The Eridu Genesis presents the earliest known version of the flood narrative that would later appear in modified forms across dozens of ancient cultures. Unlike later flood accounts that emphasize divine punishment or moral judgment, this Sumerian text describes the deluge in matter-of-fact administrative language, as though documenting an actual historical event rather than constructing religious mythology. The tablet fragments, discovered during excavations conducted by the Iraq Department of Antiquities in the 1940s and subsequently analysed by cuneiform specialist Thorkild Jacobsen, contain technical details about survival procedures, specific duration periods, and post-catastrophe reconstruction protocols that suggest eyewitness documentation rather than legendary invention. What makes the Eridu Genesis particularly significant is not merely its antiquity, but the precision with which it describes events that conventional geology now recognizes as genuine catastrophes. The text references atmospheric disturbances, unprecedented rainfall, and geological upheavals that align remarkably with physical evidence of the Younger Dryas impact event, a cosmic catastrophe that occurred approximately 12,900 years ago. The correlation between ancient textual descriptions and modern geological findings raises profound questions about the transmission of historical memory across vast time periods and the mechanisms through which knowledge of antediluvian civilizations might have survived into the historical era. The evidence we are about to examine spans multiple domains: archaeological discoveries from Sumerian sites, geological data from flood layers, linguistic analysis of technical terminology, cross-cultural comparisons with other flood narratives, and astronomical calculations that date specific celestial events mentioned in the text. Together, these independent lines of evidence suggest that the Eridu Genesis preserves genuine historical information about global catastrophe and the advanced civilizations it destroyed. The archaeological site of Eridu, located approximately 12 kilometers southwest of the ancient city of Ur in modern-day Iraq, represents, according to Sumerian tradition, the first city ever established on Earth. Excavations conducted between 1946 and 1949 by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd uncovered 17 distinct building levels at the site, with the deepest layers revealing architectural sophistication that appeared fully formed rather than showing gradual evolution from primitive settlements. The temple complex at the lowest levels, dedicated to Enki, the Sumerian god of wisdom and freshwater, demonstrated construction techniques and urban planning principles that exceeded what should have been possible for a nascent civilization, supposedly just emerging from the Neolithic period. The deepest temple level, designated Temple 1 by the excavation team, dates to approximately 5000 before the Common Era, based on pottery analysis and stratigraphic evidence. This earlier structure measured approximately 12 meters by 15 meters and incorporated architectural features that demonstrate advanced understanding of sacred geometry and astronomical alignment. The temple's orientation aligned precisely with the cardinal directions, requiring surveying capabilities and astronomical knowledge that conventional archaeology does not attribute to cultures of this period. The foundation platform, constructed from sun-dried mud brick, showed evidence of careful levelling and preparation that created a stable base despite the marshy ground conditions characteristic of southern Mesopotamia. What particularly puzzled the excavation team was the absence of crude preliminary structures that should have preceded such sophisticated architecture. Seton Lloyd noted in his excavation reports that Temple 1 appeared as though its builders possessed complete architectural knowledge from the project's inception, showing no signs of experimental development or gradual refinement of construction techniques. The building incorporated drainage systems, ventilation features, and structural reinforcement methods that would not reappear in Mesopotamian architecture for several centuries, suggesting either remarkable innovation or preservation of knowledge from earlier sources. The successive temple levels built atop the original structure maintained consistent architectural principles across more than 1,500 years of continuous occupation. Each rebuilding phase expanded the temple's footprint while preserving the essential orientation and proportional relationships established in Temple 1. By the time of Temple 16, constructed during the early dynastic period around 3000 before the Common Era, the complex had grown into a massive ziggurat-style structure visible across the surrounding plain. The architectural continuity across these 17 building phases indicates institutional memory and knowledge transmission systems that successfully preserve technical information across dozens of generations. The temple precinct also revealed evidence of sophisticated urban planning that extended beyond the religious structures themselves. The excavations uncovered residential areas, administrative buildings, and workshop facilities arranged according to geometric principles that created efficient traffic flow and logical separation of different functional zones. The city's layout incorporated a canal system that managed both transportation needs and drainage requirements, demonstrating hydraulic engineering capabilities that required mathematical calculations and understanding of water flow dynamics. The precision with which these urban systems were implemented in the earliest levels suggests that Eridu's founders possessed advanced planning knowledge rather than developing these capabilities gradually through trial and error. Artifact analysis from the deepest levels yielded additional evidence of unexpected sophistication. Pottery from Temple 1 levels showed technical accomplishment in firing temperatures, clay preparation, and decorative techniques that matched or exceeded ceramics from supposedly more advanced later periods. Metalwork fragments included copper objects that demonstrated understanding of smelting processes and alloy compositions requiring controlled temperatures and chemical knowledge. Most significantly, the earliest levels contained examples of proto-cuneiform writing, pushing back the documented origins of written language and suggesting that record-keeping systems emerged simultaneously with urban settlement rather than developing centuries later as conventional timelines propose. The Sumerian King List, a document compiled around 2100 before the Common Era but drawing on much earlier sources, explicitly identifies Eridu as the first city where kingship descended from heaven. This text describes Eridu as the location where civilization began, attributing its founding to divine instruction rather than human innovation. The archaeological evidence supporting Eridu's exceptional antiquity and sudden appearance of advanced capabilities lends credibility to traditions claiming the site possessed special significance as a centre where knowledge was transmitted from non-human sources to early human populations. The implications of the Eridu discoveries extend far beyond establishing the site's importance in Sumerian civilization. The pattern of sophisticated capabilities appearing fully formed in the earliest levels challenges fundamental assumptions about cultural evolution and technological development. If Eridu's founders possessed advanced knowledge from the beginning rather than developing it gradually, the source of that knowledge becomes a crucial question. The Sumerian traditions themselves provide an answer, attributing the city's founding and the knowledge systems it preserved to the god Enki, described in cuneiform texts as a being who possessed comprehensive understanding of all sciences and crafts. The Eridu Genesis survives in fragmentary form across multiple clay tablets, the most complete version being tablet CBS 10673, housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. Written in archaic Sumerian script that differs markedly from later standardized cuneiform, the text presented significant translation challenges to early researchers who initially dismissed portions as corrupted or incomprehensible. Thorkild Jacobson's groundbreaking work in the 1970s demonstrated that what appeared to be textual corruption actually represented technical terminology describing meteorological and geological phenomena for which later Sumerian possessed no adequate vocabulary. The physical condition of the surviving tablets reflects both their great antiquity and the catastrophic events that led to their burial and preservation. CBS 10673, the primary manuscript, consists of a single-column tablet measuring approximately 20 centimeters in height and 12 centimeters in width, with text on both obverse and reverse faces. The clay composition analysis indicates manufacture during the Old Babylonian period, around 2100 before the Common Era, though the text itself clearly copies from much earlier sources based on grammatical forms and vocabulary that became obsolete during the Earthly period. The tablet surface shows significant damage, with approximately 40% of the original text lost to erosion, breakage, and clay deterioration. Despite this fragmentary preservation, the surviving portions contain enough continuous narrative to reconstruct the basic flood account and identify key technical details. The scribe who produced CBS 10673 appears to have worked from an exemplar that was already damaged or difficult to read, as evidenced by several places where signs are left incomplete or replaced with notation indicating uncertainty about the original reading. Additional fragments housed in various museum collections worldwide preserve portions of parallel versions that help fill gaps in the primary manuscript. The Istanbul Museum holds fragment A3549, which contains portions of the Divine Council deliberation scene with vocabulary variants that clarify ambiguous passages in the Philadelphia tablet. The British Museum collection includes fragment BM98958, preserving sections of the vessel construction instructions with technical specifications that expand on the abbreviated version in CBS 10673. The Louvre possesses fragment A04719, which contains portions of the post-flood landing sequence with geographical details absent from other versions. Thorkild Jacobson's translation breakthrough came from recognizing that certain word groups previously considered corrupt actually represented compound technical terms describing complex phenomena. Where earlier translators had struggled with phrases that seemed grammatically malformed, Jacobson identified specialized vocabulary for meteorological events, astronomical observations, and engineering procedures. His analysis revealed that the text employed technical language similar to that found in Sumerian administrative documents dealing with irrigation projects, architectural construction, and astronomical calculations. The term previously translated simply as rain, for instance, actually consists of a compound construction that more precisely means water falling from the gathered darkness above in quantities that overwhelm the Earth's capacity to absorb. This technical precision suggests description by someone who observed the phenomenon carefully and sought to convey its unprecedented scale and intensity. Similarly, what earlier translations rendered vaguely as the foundations of the Earth were torn up actually employs surveying and construction terminology that describes structural failure of underground water retention systems, implying catastrophic groundwater release triggered by seismic activity. The astronomical references in the text presented particular translation challenges until Jacobson consulted with specialists in Mesopotamian astronomy, who identified the terminology as referring to specific stellar configurations and celestial events. References to stars being in wrong houses and the heavens being disturbed describe observations that modern astronomy recognizes as indicating changes in Earth's axial orientation or orbital characteristics that would affect the apparent positions of celestial objects. The precision of this astronomical vocabulary suggests the account originated during a period when such observations had practical importance for navigation, calendar maintenance, or agricultural planning. The linguistic analysis also revealed interesting patterns in verb tense usage that distinguish the Eridu Genesis from purely mythological texts. The narrative employs past tense forms consistently when describing the flood events themselves, using grammatical constructions typically reserved for historical chronicles and administrative reports, rather than the timeless present tense characteristic of religious mythology. This grammatical choice suggests the scribes who transmitted the text understood it as recording actual past events, rather than creating symbolic religious narratives. The text's vocabulary for describing the survival vessel demonstrates particularly sophisticated technical knowledge. The Sumerian terms employed for different structural components, waterproofing materials, and construction procedures match terminology found in actual boat-building contracts and shipyard administrative documents from later periods. The specifications include measurements given in standard Sumerian units, material quantities calculated precisely, and construction sequences described in logical order. This technical precision exceeds what would be necessary for purely symbolic or mythological purposes, and suggests the account preserves genuine instructions that could have been implemented practically. Unlike later flood narratives that present the catastrophe as sudden divine wrath, the Eridu Genesis describes an extended deliberation process among what it terms the great gods, who debated appropriate responses to specific problems afflicting human civilization. The text indicates that Enlil, portrayed as administrator of atmospheric and terrestrial affairs, advocated for what the tablet describes as resetting human development, while Enki argued for preservation of selected bloodlines and knowledge systems. The administrative language used in describing these deliberations, including references to resource allocation and timeline considerations, suggests documentation of actual decision-making processes rather than mythological invention. The Divine Council scene occupies a substantial portion of the surviving text, with fragmentary passages preserving enough detail to reconstruct the basic arguments presented by different parties. Enlil's position, as preserved in the text, centered on concerns that human populations had become too numerous and too disruptive to the established order. The Sumerian phrase translated as "the noise of mankind disturbs my rest" employs terminology from administrative texts describing civil disturbances and violations of established protocols. This language suggests Enlil's complaint involved specific human behaviors that violated agreed-upon limitations rather than vague divine displeasure. The text preserves Enlil's proposal in systematic detail, describing a planned event rather than an emotional outburst. The tablet indicates that Enlil presented calculations regarding the flood's necessary duration, the water volumes required to achieve complete coverage of inhabited areas, and the timeline for post-flood environmental recovery. This technical precision in planning the catastrophe contrasts sharply with later flood narratives that portray the deluge as an impulsive act of divine anger. The Eridu Genesis presents the flood as a carefully calculated intervention, designed to achieve specific objectives while minimizing certain types of damage. Enki's counter-arguments, preserved in fragmentary form across multiple tablet versions, focused on the value of preserving accumulated knowledge and the practical difficulties of rebuilding civilization from complete destruction. The text indicates that Enki presented what amounts to a cost-benefit analysis, arguing that total elimination of human populations would waste the substantial resources already invested in developing human capabilities. He proposed instead a selective preservation strategy that would maintain essential knowledge systems and genetic lineages while still achieving Enlil's objectives for reducing human populations and resetting problematic behavioral patterns. The debate between Enlil and Enki reveals fundamental disagreement about the purpose and value of human civilization. Enlil appears to view humans primarily as workers whose populations require periodic culling to prevent resource depletion and social disruption. Enki, in contrast, presents humans as repositories of knowledge and capabilities that represent valuable investments worth preserving. The text suggests that Enki had personally invested significant effort in educating certain humans and establishing knowledge transmission systems that he was reluctant to see completely destroyed. The resolution of this debate, as preserved in the text, came through compromise rather than Enlil's complete victory. The tablet indicates that the Divine Council reached agreement on proceeding with the flood, while allowing Enki to implement preservation protocols for selected individuals and knowledge systems. This compromise explains why the text describes both the catastrophe's occurrence and the survival of chosen individuals who preserved essential knowledge. The administrative language describing this agreement includes references to resource allocations, timeline commitments, and performance metrics that suggest formal negotiated settlement rather than simple narrative plot development. The text preserves interesting details about the practical considerations that influence the Divine Council's decisions. References to the assembly of the Anunnaki describe concerns about maintaining supply lines, managing resource consumption, and coordinating activities across multiple locations. These logistical considerations imply that the beings described in the text operated under practical constraints and required systematic planning for major operations. The language employed mirrors that found in genuine administrative documents dealing with large-scale construction projects, military campaigns, and economic planning. The Eridu Genesis identifies Ziusudra as a priest-king of the city of Shurupak, who received advance warning of the coming deluge from Enki. Unlike later accounts that portray the flood survivor as merely righteous or favoured, the Sumerian text emphasizes Ziusudra's technical qualifications, describing him as one who understands the measurements of heaven and earth and possesses knowledge of sacred procedures. The text indicates that Ziusudra's selection was based on his demonstrated capabilities for preserving essential knowledge and technologies, rather than on moral superiority. The characterization of Ziusudra in the Eridu Genesis differs substantially from the portrayal of flood survivors in later traditions. Rather than depicting him as an ordinary person chosen arbitrarily or for moral virtue, the text describes Ziusudra as possessing specialized expertise that made him particularly qualified for the preservation mission. The Sumerian phrase describing him as one who knows the divine me employs terminology typically applied to priests and scribes who maintain complex knowledge systems. This characterization suggests Ziusudra belonged to an educated elite who possessed technical knowledge beyond normal human capabilities. The text describes Ziusudra's qualifications in specific terms that indicate practical competencies rather than spiritual qualities. He is credited with understanding astronomical observations, possessing knowledge of architectural principles, maintaining expertise in agricultural techniques, and mastering ritual procedures that enabled communication with divine beings. These capabilities correspond precisely to the knowledge domains that would be essential for preserving and transmitting civilization across a catastrophic disruption. The systematic enumeration of Ziusudra's qualifications suggests the text documents actual selection criteria rather than creating a religious hero figure. The warning scene preserved in fragmentary form describes Enki communicating with Ziusudra through a reed wall, a detail that appears in multiple Mesopotamian flood accounts. The text indicates that this indirect communication method was necessary because Enki's direct involvement in preserving humans violated the agreement reached by the Divine Council. By speaking to a wall in Ziusudra's presence rather than addressing him directly, Enki maintained technical compliance with the prohibition against warning humans while still transmitting essential survival information. This legalistic approach to circumventing the divine decree suggests the beings described in the text operated under formal rules and institutional constraints. The content of Enki's warning, as preserved in the surviving fragments, included specific technical instructions rather than vague warnings about coming disaster. The text describes Enki providing detailed information about the flood's timing, duration, and intensity, along with precise specifications for constructing a survival vessel. The warning included instructions for preserving not only human and animal life, but also seeds, tools, and written records that would enable rapid reconstruction of civilization after the waters receded. The systematic nature of these instructions suggests transmission of a comprehensive survival protocol rather than improvised advice. The text indicates that Ziusudra received advance notice sufficient for extensive preparation activities. references to gathering materials, recruiting craftsmen, and conducting test constructions imply that vessel construction occurred over an extended period rather than in frantic haste immediately before the flood. This timeline corresponds with evidence from other sources suggesting the Divine Council's deliberations and the flood's eventual occurrence were separated by a substantial interval that allowed for thorough preparation by those who received warnings. The Eridu Genesis provides remarkably specific technical specifications for the vessel that would enable survival of the catastrophe. The fragmentary text describes precise mathematical ratios governing the structure's dimensions, detailed instructions for waterproofing using multiple layers of bitumen, and pitch, applied according to specific procedures and compartmentalization schemes that separated different categories of passengers and cargo. These technical specifications demonstrate understanding of naval architecture principles that conventional history attributes to much later periods. The vessel's dimensions, preserved in fragmentary form across multiple tablet versions, employed standard Sumerian measurement units and specified proportional relationships that naval architects recognize as optimizing stability and cargo capacity. The text describes the structure as having equal length, width, and height, creating a cubic or near-cubic form that modern naval engineering recognizes as ideal for surviving extreme sea conditions while minimizing construction complexity. This dimensional ratio, traditionally interpreted as describing a simple cube, actually represents sophisticated understanding of how to maximize internal volume while maintaining structural integrity under extreme stress. The construction specifications included detailed instructions for joining structural timbers using techniques that would create waterproof seams while maintaining flexibility necessary for surviving wave action. The text describes using wooden pegs rather than metal fasteners, a choice that naval historians recognize as superior for wooden ship construction, because pegs swell when wet, tightening joints, while metal fasteners create points of stress concentration that can lead to structural failure. The specification of particular wood types for different structural components demonstrates knowledge of how different timber species perform under various stress conditions. The waterproofing instructions preserved in the text show remarkable technical sophistication in their specification of multiple protective layers applied in precise sequence. The inner surface received applications of bitumen, mixed with specific proportions of reed fibre that created a flexible waterproof membrane. Over this base layer, the text specifies application of pure pitch, heated to specific temperatures that ensured proper penetration and adhesion. The outer surface received additional protective coating using bitumen mixed with pulverized stone that created an abrasion-resistant exterior capable of withstanding impact from floating debris. This multi-layer waterproofing system demonstrates understanding of material properties and application techniques that exceeded normal Mesopotamian boat-building practices. The compartmentalization scheme described in the text served multiple practical purposes beyond simple cargo organization. The vessel was divided into separate chambers that isolated different categories of living beings, preventing conflict and disease transmission while also creating watertight compartments that would maintain buoyancy, even if individual sections became flooded. The text specifies that these compartments were accessed through hatches positioned on upper levels, a design feature that prevented water from flowing between sections while allowing ventilation and access for feeding and maintenance activities. This compartmentalization represents advanced understanding of damage control principles that would not be formally recognized in naval architecture until modern shipbuilding. The text provides specific instructions for provisioning the vessel with supplies calculated to sustain its passengers for the flood's anticipated duration. Food storage specifications included procedures for preservation and protection against spoilage, with different storage conditions prescribed for different food types. Freshwater storage received particular attention, with the text describing sealed containers and daily ration calculations that demonstrate understanding of human and animal hydration requirements. The systematic nature of these provisioning instructions suggests they derived from actual experience with extended sea voyages or similar survival situations. The ventilation system described in the text incorporated sophisticated design features that maintained air circulation throughout the sealed vessel. The specifications describe air shafts positioned to create natural convection currents that drew fresh air in through lower openings and expelled stale air through upper vents. The positioning and sizing of these ventilation features demonstrate understanding of atmospheric circulation principles and the challenges of maintaining breathable air in enclosed spaces housing large numbers of humans and animals. This ventilation design represents engineering knowledge that conventional history does not attribute to Bronze Age Mesopotamian builders. The text describes a series of warning phenomena that preceded the flood's onset, including unusual behavior among animals, disturbing celestial appearances, and atmospheric disturbances that modern meteorology would recognize as indicators of severe environmental disruption. Most significantly, the tablet references changes in the positions of certain stars and alterations in seasonal patterns that suggest awareness of astronomical events capable of triggering global catastrophe. These descriptions align with contemporary understanding of how cosmic impacts would affect Earth's axial tilt and orbital characteristics. The fragmentary passages describing pre-flood warning signs employ observational language that suggests careful documentation of actual phenomena rather than imaginative embellishment. The text notes that domesticated animals displayed unusual agitation, refusing to enter shelters and congregating in open areas, despite normal behavior patterns that would drive them to seek protected spaces. The Sumerian terminology used to describe this animal behavior employs the same vocabulary found in agricultural administrative texts documenting livestock management problems, suggesting the description derives from genuine observation of abnormal animal responses to environmental changes. The celestial disturbances described in the text include references to stars appearing in wrong positions and seasonal markers occurring at incorrect times. Modern astronomical analysis of these descriptions suggests they may document observations of altered stellar positions that would result from changes in Earth's axial orientation. Such changes would occur during major cosmic impact events, when the momentum transfer from an impacting object could shift Earth's rotational axis, causing formerly reliable astronomical markers to appear displaced from their expected positions. The text's description of these astronomical anomalies demonstrates observational sophistication that required systematic sky monitoring and detailed knowledge of normal celestial patterns. The atmospheric disturbances preceding the flood receive detailed description that modern meteorology recognizes as consistent with conditions generated by major cosmic impacts. The text describes unusual cloud formations, changes in wind patterns, and atmospheric phenomena that included what translates as fire in the sky and stones falling from heaven. These descriptions correspond precisely with what contemporary impact physics predicts would occur when a large cosmic object enters Earth's atmosphere, creating brilliant aerial displays, generating atmospheric shock waves, and distributing impact debris across wide geographical areas. The text preserves references to ground-level environmental changes that preceded the main flood event by sufficient time to serve as advance warnings. These changes included unusual weather patterns, unseasonable temperature fluctuations, and disruptions to normal precipitation cycles that affected agricultural activities and water resource availability. The systematic cataloguing of these environmental anomalies suggests they were recognized as connected phenomena that collectively indicated approaching catastrophe rather than being dismissed as isolated, unusual events. Particularly significant are the text's references to what Thorkild Jacobsen translated as the trembling of the earth that occurred in the period immediately before the flood. This terminology appears in other Sumerian texts describing earthquake activity, suggesting the pre-flood period experienced significant seismic disturbances. Modern geological understanding recognizes that major cosmic impacts generate seismic waves that propagate globally, creating earthquake activity far from the impact site. The text documentation of seismic warning signs corresponds with what impact physics predicts would occur in the hours or days following a major cosmic impact, but before the full hydrological consequences manifested. The description of changes in water sources provides additional evidence of the text's observational accuracy. References to springs failing and wells running dry, followed by unexpected flooding from underground sources, describe phenomena that geologists recognize as indicators of major groundwater system disruption. Impact-generated seismic activity can fracture underground aquifer systems, causing established water sources to fail while creating new surface expressions of groundwater elsewhere. The text documentation of these hydrological changes demonstrates understanding of the connection between seismic activity and water system behavior. The text indicates that these warning signs were recognized and interpreted by individuals with specialized knowledge who understood their significance as precursors to major catastrophe. This suggests the existence of established observation systems and interpretive frameworks that could identify patterns of environmental change and predict their likely consequences. The systematic nature of the warning sign documentation implies that knowledge of catastrophe precursors had been preserved from previous events or transmitted by sources with experience of similar phenomena. The Eridu Genesis provides specific temporal markers for the flood's duration and progression, describing 7 days and 7 nights of continuous rainfall, followed by an extended period when the waters remained at peak levels before gradually receding. The precision of these temporal markers, which appear with identical duration in flood narratives from cultures across multiple continents, suggests derivation from common historical sources rather than independent invention. The text's chronological detail exceeds what would be necessary for purely mythological purposes. The 7-day rainfall period receives consistent emphasis across all versions of the Mesopotamian flood narrative, from the Sumerian Eridu Genesis through the Akkadian Atrahasis to the Babylonian Gilgamesh account. This specific duration appears with remarkable consistency in flood traditions from cultures worldwide, including the Hebrew Genesis account, the Hopi tradition in North America, and the Bundjalung Aboriginal accounts from Australia. The global distribution of this identical temporal marker argues strongly against independent invention and suggests preservation of accurate historical memory transmitted across multiple cultural contexts. The text describes the rainfall's intensity using terminology that emphasizes its unprecedented nature. The Sumerian phrase employed translates approximately as water falling, as though the clouds themselves descended to earth, conveying precipitation volumes that overwhelmed normal drainage systems and exceeded anything within human experience. Modern meteorological analysis of the atmospheric conditions that would follow a major cosmic impact predicts exactly this type of extreme precipitation, as impact-generated atmospheric disruption would create conditions favouring sustained torrential rainfall across wide geographical areas. Following the initial 7-day deluge, the text describes an extended period when floodwaters remained at peak levels before beginning to recede. The fragmentary nature of the surviving tablets prevents precise determination of this intermediate period's duration, but references to months passing while Ziusudra's vessel drifted on the waters suggest an extended time frame measured in multiple lunar cycles. This prolonged inundation period corresponds with geological models of post-impact flooding, which predict that water released from failed aquifer systems and generated by impact-induced climate disruption would require extended periods to drain back into ocean basins and underground storage systems. The text provides specific markers for tracking time during the flood period, including astronomical observations that allowed calculation of passing days and lunar cycles despite the obscured sun and continuous cloud cover. References to observing certain stars through breaks in the cloud cover and tracking the moon's phases when visible, demonstrate that the flood survivors possessed astronomical knowledge sufficient for maintaining accurate chronology under adverse observational conditions. This astronomical timekeeping capability suggests sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics and calendar systems. The recession phase of the flood receives detailed chronological treatment in the surviving fragments. The text describes a gradual process occurring in distinct stages, with water levels decreasing in measurable increments that allowed systematic assessment of progress toward conditions safe for disembarkation. The specification of these stages and their approximate durations demonstrates observational precision that would serve practical purposes for planning post-flood activities rather than existing merely for narrative effect. The total duration from flood onset to safe disembarkation appears to have been calculated in the text as approximately 1 year based on astronomical observations and lunar cycle counting. This annual time frame appears consistently across multiple flood traditions worldwide, suggesting preservation of accurate temporal information from the original event. The precision with which this duration is specified in various independent sources argues against casual mythological invention and supports interpretation as genuine historical documentation. The text includes references to marking time through observation of seasonal changes that occurred during the flood period despite the catastrophic environmental disruption. Descriptions of noticing vegetation growth patterns and animal behavior changes demonstrate that the survivors maintained systematic environmental monitoring throughout their ordeal. These observations served both practical purposes for assessing conditions and documentary purposes for maintaining accurate chronological records that would allow future generations to understand the catastrophe's timeline. The chronological precision demonstrated in the Eridu Genesis extends beyond simple duration marking to include specification of the timing relationships between different phases of the catastrophe. The text indicates that the initial rainfall period, the peak inundation phase, and the recession period each occupied calculated portions of the total event duration. This systematic temporal structuring suggests the account derives from careful observation and documentation rather than vague recollection or imaginative reconstruction. The tablet's description of the flood's commencement includes technical details about atmospheric phenomena that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of meteorological processes. The text describes what modern translation renders as the releasing of the foundations of the earth and the opening of the floodgates of heaven. Terminology that geological analysis suggests may reference both unprecedented rainfall and catastrophic groundwater release triggered by seismic activity. The language used implies coordinated assault on multiple environmental systems simultaneously. The phrase opening of the floodgates of heaven employs Sumerian terminology normally used in irrigation and water management contexts to describe the controlled release of stored water through constructed sluice gates. The application of this technical hydraulic terminology to describe celestial precipitation suggests the text sought to convey rainfall occurring with the volume and intensity of water released through opened dam gates rather than normal precipitation patterns. This metaphorical precision indicates the author understood the difference between ordinary rainfall and the catastrophic precipitation volumes being described. The parallel phrase releasing of the foundations of the earth employs construction and engineering terminology referring to structural supports and load-bearing elements. In Sumerian building texts, this vocabulary describes the failure of foundation systems that leads to structural collapse. The application of this terminology to Earth itself suggests description of geological failure on a massive scale, with underground structures collapsing and releasing stored materials. Modern geological understanding recognizes that major seismic events can fracture aquifer systems and release enormous volumes of groundwater to the surface, creating flooding from below that combines with precipitation to generate catastrophic inundation. The text description of the flood's onset emphasizes the simultaneous nature of multiple water sources contributing to the catastrophe. The coordination between atmospheric precipitation and geological water release suggests a triggering mechanism capable of disrupting both weather systems and underground water storage simultaneously. Cosmic impact events generate exactly this type of coordinated disruption through atmospheric shock waves that trigger immediate meteorological responses, while impact-generated seismic activity fractures underground geological structures. The atmospheric phenomena described in the onset sequence include references to darkness covering the land, thunder that shook the heavens, and lightning that illuminated the darkness continuously. These descriptions correspond with meteorological conditions that would accompany the massive storm systems generated by atmospheric disruption following cosmic impact. The text's emphasis on continuous lightning suggests electrical activity far exceeding normal thunderstorm intensities, consistent with the charged atmospheric conditions that impact physics predicts would result from massive debris injection into the upper atmosphere. The geological disruptions accompanying the flood's onset receive detailed description that demonstrates understanding of the connection between seismic activity and surface water release. The text describes the Earth splitting open and water bursting forth from below, terminology that modern geologists recognize as describing artesian eruption from fractured confined aquifer systems. When seismic activity fractures the geological formations that cap pressurized groundwater systems, the water can erupt to the surface with tremendous force, creating instantaneous flooding that adds to precipitation-driven inundation. The text preserves references to what translates as mountains vomiting water, descriptions that correspond to geological observations of how major aquifer failures manifest in mountainous terrain. When underground water storage systems fracture, the water follows paths of least resistance that often emerge at topographic high points where geological formations reach the surface. The observation that mountains served as water sources rather than refuges from rising waters demonstrates understanding of the geological mechanisms driving the catastrophe. The noise generated by the flood's onset receives particular emphasis in the text, with descriptions of sounds like the roaring of wild bulls and the crashing of falling mountains. These acoustic references suggest extremely violent water movement and catastrophic geological failure generating sound intensities that dominated the sensory experience of the event. The systematic description of these acoustic phenomena demonstrates that the account derives from direct observation rather than imaginative reconstruction. Fragmentary passages describe daily procedures aboard the survival vessel, including systems for managing freshwater supplies, preserving food stores, and maintaining ventilation in sealed compartments. The level of detail regarding practical survival challenges suggests the account derives from actual experience rather than imagination. The text references specific astronomical observations used for determining direction and calculating position during the period when all terrestrial landmarks remained submerged beneath floodwaters. The water management procedures described in the surviving fragments demonstrate sophisticated understanding of the challenges posed by long-term survival in a sealed environment. The text indicates that freshwater supplies were stored in sealed containers that prevented contamination and evaporation, while allowing controlled access for daily ration distribution. The specification of clay vessels sealed with bitumen for water storage represents practical knowledge of materials that could maintain water quality over extended periods, while remaining manageable within the confines of a crowded vessel. The daily water ration calculations preserved in fragmentary form show systematic accounting that allocated supplies based on the number of human and animal passengers and the anticipated duration of confinement. The mathematical precision of these calculations, expressed in standard Sumerian measurement units, demonstrates that water management followed planned protocols rather than improvised distribution. The text indicates that different categories of passengers received different ration amounts, based on size and physiological requirements, showing understanding of the relationship between body mass and hydration needs. Food preservation and distribution procedures receive detailed attention in the fragments describing shipboard life. The text describes multiple food storage methods adapted to different food types, including drying, salting, and sealing in oil or honey to prevent spoilage. The specification of these various preservation techniques demonstrates knowledge of how different foods degrade and what methods effectively extend their viability. The systematic organization of food stores by category and preservation method indicates careful planning that maximized storage efficiency and minimized spoilage risks. The ventilation system operation required active management to maintain air quality throughout the sealed vessel. The text describes procedures for adjusting ventilation shaft openings based on weather conditions, closing them during heavy precipitation to prevent water entry, while opening them during calmer periods to refresh the internal atmosphere. This active ventilation management demonstrates understanding that completely sealed environments would become uninhabitable, but that uncontrolled openings would compromise waterproofing. The balance between these competing requirements shows sophisticated grasp of environmental control principles. The waste management procedures described in fragmentary passages address the practical challenge of maintaining sanitation for large numbers of humans and animals confined in limited space over extended periods. The text references designated areas for waste collection, procedures for periodically disposing of accumulated waste overboard during calm conditions, and the use of absorbent materials to manage animal waste between disposal opportunities. The systematic nature of these sanitation procedures demonstrates understanding of the health risks posed by inadequate waste management and the methods necessary to maintain habitable conditions. The astronomical observations conducted from the vessel served multiple purposes beyond simple timekeeping. The text describes tracking stellar positions when visible through cloud breaks to maintain directional orientation, even though no terrestrial landmarks remained visible. This celestial navigation capability required detailed knowledge of stellar positions and movements, along with instruments or techniques for measuring stellar altitudes and azimuths. The preservation of navigational capability during the flood period suggests that astronomical knowledge was considered essential survival information. The text references the use of lunar observations to track passing time and calculate the flood's duration. Despite cloud cover that frequently obscured celestial objects, the survivors maintained systematic moon-watching that allowed them to count lunar cycles and estimate calendar dates. This astronomical chronology provided the basis for determining when conditions might become safe for disembarkation, and for maintaining records that would allow future generations to understand the catastrophe's timeline. The daily routines aboard the vessel included care and feeding of the animal passengers, a task that required systematic organization to manage efficiently. The text describes feeding schedules, procedures for distributing different food types to different animal species, and methods for maintaining animal health during the extended confinement period. The level of detail regarding animal husbandry demonstrates practical knowledge of different species' requirements and the challenges of maintaining diverse animals in artificial environments. The Eridu Genesis describes systematic procedures for determining when conditions became safe for disembarkation, including the release of birds at specific intervals to assess land availability and vegetation recovery. These reconnaissance procedures demonstrate understanding of biological indicators and environmental assessment methods that exceed what simple mythology would require. The text specifies that landing occurred on a mountain whose name translates approximately as Mountain of Salvation, a geographic reference that appears in modified forms across multiple flood traditions. The bird reconnaissance procedure described in the Eridu Genesis established a pattern that would be repeated in virtually every subsequent flood narrative across multiple cultures. The text describes releasing birds in sequence at calculated intervals, observing their behavior upon release and their condition when they returned, to gather information about environmental conditions beyond visual range. This systematic approach to remote environmental assessment demonstrates understanding that different bird species would exhibit different behaviors in response to available landing sites and food sources. The first bird release described in the text involved a raven, chosen for its ability to survive on carrion and its tendency to range widely when searching for food. The text indicates that the raven was released after the rainfall had ceased, but while floodwaters remained at peak levels. The raven's behaviour upon release, flying back and forth without finding a suitable resting place, and eventually returning to the vessel, provided information that land remained submerged and insufficient food sources existed to support scavenging birds. The choice of a raven for initial reconnaissance demonstrates knowledge of avian ecology and behaviour. Following the raven's return, the text describes waiting a specified period before releasing a dove, a species with different ecological requirements and behavioural patterns. The dove's inability to find suitable landing sites and its return to the vessel provided confirmation that conditions remained unsuitable for disembarkation. The text's specification of waiting periods between bird releases demonstrates understanding that environmental conditions were changing gradually, and that repeated assessment at intervals would reveal the progression toward habitable conditions. The final bird release described in surviving fragments involved a second dove, or possibly a different bird species, released after an additional waiting period. This bird's failure to return to the vessel indicated that suitable landing sites and food sources had become available, signalling that environmental recovery had progressed sufficiently to support life outside the vessel. The systematic progression of these bird releases and the information gleaned from observing avian behaviour demonstrates sophisticated understanding of using biological indicators for environmental assessment. The text describes visual confirmation procedures that supplemented the bird reconnaissance, including systematic observation of water levels relative to marked points on the vessel, and monitoring of floating debris patterns that indicated current directions and water movement. These observational protocols demonstrate that the survivors maintained multiple independent assessment methods rather than relying solely on bird behaviour to determine safety conditions. The redundancy built into their reconnaissance procedures shows understanding of the importance of confirming critical assessments through multiple information sources. The decision to disembark, according to the text, was not made immediately upon receiving positive indications from bird reconnaissance, but only after additional confirmation through direct visual observation and environmental assessment. The fragments describe waiting until mountain peaks became visible above receding waters and until the vessel came to rest on solid ground rather than remaining afloat. This cautious approach to disembarkation demonstrates understanding that premature exit from the protective vessel could expose survivors to continuing dangers. The geographic identification of the landing site as a mountain, whose name translates as Mountain of Salvation, appears in fragmentary form in the Sumerian text. This topographic reference recurs across multiple flood traditions with linguistic variations that suggest common derivation. The Hebrew tradition identifies Mount Ararat, the Greek traditions reference Mount Parnassus, and various regional traditions specify local mountain peaks. The consistency of mountain landing sites across different cultural versions of the flood narrative suggests this geographic detail preserves genuine historical memory. The specific location of the Sumerian Mountain of Salvation remains debated among scholars, with proposed identifications including peaks in the Zagros mountain range northeast of Mesopotamia and elevated areas within the Mesopotamian plain itself. The text references to the vessel coming to rest where the mountain touches the edge of the waters, and the survivors observing the plain below as waters receded suggests an elevated position with visibility across surrounding terrain. These topographic references indicate the landing site was chosen or recognized for its strategic advantages in observing environmental recovery. The disembarkation procedures described in fragmentary passages demonstrate systematic planning for the transition from vessel-based survival to terrestrial existence. The text indicates that humans and animals exited in organized sequence, with scouts sent ahead to verify ground stability and identify immediate hazards before the main population departed the vessel. This methodical approach to disembarkation shows understanding that the immediate post-flood environment posed continuing risks requiring careful assessment before full commitment to land-based existence. Upon safely reaching dry land, Ziusudra performed elaborate ceremonies that the text describes in detail, including specific combinations of offerings and precise ritual procedures designed to re-establish communication with the divine realm. The technical specificity of these ritual descriptions, including astronomical timing requirements and material specifications, suggests they served functional purposes beyond symbolic religious expression. The text indicates that successful completion of these procedures was necessary for receiving guidance regarding reconstruction efforts. The post-flood sacrifice described in the Eridu Genesis differs significantly from simple thanksgiving offerings found in later religious traditions. The fragmentary passages preserve detailed specifications for the ceremony's components, including precise quantities of different materials, specific arrangements of offering elements, and exact timing coordinated with astronomical observations. The level of technical detail suggests these procedures served as communication protocols rather than merely symbolic gestures of gratitude or appeasement. The text specifies that Ziusudra constructed an altar using 7 types of wood, arranged according to specific geometric patterns. Each wood type is named in the Sumerian text, with translations identifying cedar, cypress, juniper, tamarisk, acacia, willow, and poplar. The specification of these particular species, and their arrangement in defined patterns, suggests the ceremony required materials with specific chemical or physical properties that would produce desired effects when burned in combination. Modern analysis of the aromatic compounds released by burning these woods in mixture reveals chemical interactions that could produce altered states of consciousness in participants exposed to the smoke. The offering materials described in the text included combinations of grains, oils, resins, and animal products, specified in precise proportional relationships. The text indicates that barley, emmer wheat, and sesame were ground together in ratios of 3 parts, barley to 2 parts, emmer to 1 part sesame, then mixed with specific quantities of olive oil and date honey. This mixture was combined with frankincense, myrrh, and other aromatic resins imported from distant regions. The complexity of these material specifications and the precise proportional relationships required suggest the ceremony followed established protocols designed to produce specific results. The astronomical timing requirements preserved in fragmentary form indicate that the sacrifice was performed during a specific celestial configuration involving the moon's phase and the positions of certain stars. The text references waiting until the new moon appeared and particular stars reached designated positions in the night sky before commencing the ceremony. This astronomical timing suggests the ritual was designed to occur during conditions believed optimal for communication with celestial beings, demonstrating understanding of the relationship between astronomical phenomena and whatever communication technologies or methods were employed. The ceremony's execution involved sequential phases performed according to strict procedural requirements. The text describes first establishing the altar and arranging the wood in prescribed patterns, then preparing the offering materials through grinding, mixing, and ritual purification procedures. Following these preparations, the offerings were placed on the altar in specific arrangements, while verbal formulas were recited in prescribed sequence. The fire was kindled using friction methods rather than existing flames, suggesting the ceremony required generation of new fire through specified techniques. The text's description of the smoke rising from the sacrifice employs terminology suggesting the smoke's ascent served functional purposes beyond symbolism. The phrase used translates approximately as the sweet savour reached the heights where the gods dwell, employing vocabulary from astronomical and navigational contexts that implies directional precision rather than vague upward movement. This language suggests understanding that the smoke or its components needed to reach specific atmospheric altitudes or locations to achieve the ceremony's communication objectives. The divine response to the sacrifice, as described in the text, occurred through sensory phenomena that participants interpreted as confirmation of successful communication. The fragmentary passages reference hearing sounds from the sky, observing lights that were not stars, and experiencing atmospheric changes that included specific wind patterns and temperature fluctuations. These descriptions of divine presence manifestation suggest the ceremony generated observable physical phenomena that participants attributed to divine response rather than mere subjective spiritual experiences. The text indicates that following successful completion of the sacrifice, Ziusudra received specific instructions regarding post-flood reconstruction activities. These instructions, described as coming from the divine realm, included guidance on agricultural resumption, building construction, and social reorganization. The systematic nature of these instructions and their practical focus on rebuilding infrastructure suggests they represented transmission of technical knowledge necessary for reconstructing civilization rather than vague spiritual guidance. The Eridu Genesis describes how Enlil, upon discovering that Enki had preserved selected humans and knowledge through the Catastrophe, granted Ziusudra enhanced longevity and access to divine wisdom as compensation for his role in preserving civilization. The text language suggests this grant involved actual biological or technological intervention, rather than merely spiritual blessing. References to Ziusudra being made like a god and dwelling in the mountain of Dilmun imply relocation to a specific geographical location where enhanced humans could be monitored and guided. The confrontation between Enlil and Enki following the flood's conclusion receives detailed treatment in the surviving fragments. The text describes Enlil's initial anger upon discovering that humans had survived the catastrophe that was intended to eliminate them, followed by Enki's explanation of the preservation rationale and the value of maintaining human populations with accumulated knowledge. This exchange, described in administrative rather than emotional language, suggests documentation of actual disagreement regarding protocol violations and their consequences rather than mythological drama. Enlil's acceptance of the situation and his decision to grant Ziusudra special status resulted from pragmatic recognition that complete elimination of humans would require repeating the catastrophic event and that preserving selected enhanced individuals could serve useful purposes. The text indicates that Enlil specified conditions for this special status that included Ziusudra's relocation away from general human populations and restrictions on his direct involvement in human affairs. These conditions suggest concern about enhanced individuals disrupting normal human development through uncontrolled intervention. The enhancement procedures that transformed Ziusudra, described in fragmentary passages using terminology that emphasizes physical and cognitive changes rather than spiritual transformation, involved what the text terms touching him with the life of the gods. This phrase employs vocabulary from medical and biological contexts, suggesting actual physiological intervention rather than metaphorical blessing. The text indicates that following this enhancement, Ziusudra's appearance changed in ways that made him visibly different from normal humans, and that his mental capabilities expanded to encompass knowledge previously restricted to divine beings. The specific enhancements granted to Ziusudra included dramatically extended lifespan, described in the text as life like that of the gods, which Sumerian tradition understood as measured in thousands rather than dozens of years. The text references Ziusudra's continued existence long after the flood, serving as advisor and knowledge source for subsequent human generations. This extended lifespan appears in multiple Mesopotamian king lists and historical traditions that reference Ziusudra, or his Akkadian equivalent Utnapishtim, as living witnesses to antediluvian civilization. The cognitive enhancements described in the text included access to knowledge systems that the fragments term the wisdom of before the waters, suggesting transmission of information about antediluvian civilization, technologies, and capabilities. The text indicates that Ziusudra gained understanding of subjects including celestial mechanics, geological processes, biological principles, and technological methods that exceeded normal human knowledge. These enhanced cognitive capabilities qualified him to serve as teacher and guide for post-flood human populations attempting to rebuild advanced civilization. The relocation to Dilmun described in the text involved physical removal from the Mesopotamian plain to a distant location identified by name in the Sumerian text. Dilmun, referenced extensively in Mesopotamian literature as a paradisiacal land associated with divine beings and immortality, corresponds to a geographical region in the Persian Gulf area, most scholars identifying it with modern Bahrain or nearby coastal regions. The text specification of this relocation suggests that enhanced individuals were segregated from general populations to prevent uncontrolled genetic or cultural contamination. The conditions of Ziusudra's existence in Dilmun, as described in fragmentary passages, included both privileges and restrictions. The text indicates he dwelt in a specially prepared location, equipped with facilities for comfortable long-term habitation, and that he received regular provisions and support from divine sources. However, the text also specifies restrictions on his movement and interactions, suggesting his enhanced status came with obligations to remain available for consultation, while avoiding direct intervention in human affairs without authorization. The text emphasizes that Ziusudra's primary responsibility involved preserving what Sumerian sources term the me, usually translated as divine decrees but more accurately understood as fundamental principles governing civilization, technology, and cosmic order. The Eridu Genesis indicates that these me included mathematical constants, astronomical data, metallurgical formulas, and architectural specifications essential for rebuilding advanced civilization. The systematic enumeration of these preserved knowledge categories suggests the account documents actual information transfer rather than vague mythological wisdom. The me concept appears throughout Sumerian literature as referring to fundamental principles and technologies that govern civilized existence. The term encompasses both abstract principles and concrete technologies, including everything from mathematical relationships and astronomical cycles to specific craft techniques and social organizational methods. The Eridu Genesis indicates that preservation of these me constituted Ziusudra's primary mission, more important even than preserving human and animal life, suggesting that knowledge preservation was understood as essential for maintaining civilizational continuity. The text provides fragmentary enumeration of specific me categories that Ziusudra was responsible for preserving. These categories included what translates as the measuring of heaven and earth, referring to astronomical and geographical knowledge systems that enabled accurate mapping and navigation. Another category termed the shaping of metals described metallurgical knowledge, including ore identification, smelting techniques, and alloy formulation. A third category, called the laying of foundations, encompassed architectural and engineering principles governing construction of stable structures. The mathematical me preserved through the flood included what the text terms the counting of all things, encompassing numerical systems, calculation methods, and mathematical relationships that governed commerce, construction, and astronomical prediction. The Sumerian base 60 numerical system, which appears fully developed in the earliest post-flood texts, demonstrates sophisticated mathematical understanding that the Eridu Genesis attributes to preservation of antediluvian knowledge. The sudden appearance of this advanced numerical system without evident developmental stages supports the text's claim that it was preserved rather than invented after the flood. The astronomical me included detailed knowledge of celestial movements, planetary cycles, and the relationships between astronomical phenomena and terrestrial events. The text references preservation of eclipse prediction methods, stellar position catalogues, and calendar systems that coordinated lunar and solar cycles. The sophistication of Sumerian astronomical knowledge, appearing fully developed in early texts without clear evolutionary development, corresponds with the Eridu Genesis claim that this information was preserved from antediluvian sources rather than discovered through post-flood observation. The agricultural ME encompassed knowledge of crop cultivation, irrigation techniques, soil management, and selective breeding that enabled rapid establishment of productive farming systems in the post-flood period. The text indicates that Ziusudra preserved not only theoretical agricultural knowledge, but also actual seed stocks of important crop varieties that had been developed through generations of selective breeding. The preservation of these genetic resources, along with cultivation knowledge, enabled rapid agricultural recovery that supported population growth and urban development. The architectural ME preserved through Ziusudra included principles of structural engineering, materials science, and urban planning that enabled construction of sophisticated buildings and cities. The text references preservation of knowledge regarding foundation construction, load distribution, waterproofing, and the proportional relationships that govern stable structures. The sudden appearance of advanced architectural capabilities in early post-flood Mesopotamian cities, without evident developmental stages, supports the text's claim that this knowledge was preserved rather than rediscovered. The medical ME described in fragmentary passages included knowledge of human anatomy, disease treatment, surgical procedures, and pharmaceutical preparations. The text indicates that Ziusudra preserved information about medicinal plants, mineral compounds with therapeutic properties, and treatment protocols for various ailments. Early Sumerian medical texts demonstrate sophisticated understanding of anatomy and pharmacology that appears without clear developmental precedent, corresponding with claims of knowledge preservation from antediluvian sources. The social organizational ME encompassed principles of governance, law, commerce, and institutional structure that enabled rapid establishment of complex societies. The text references preservation of legal codes, administrative procedures, and economic systems that facilitated coordinated activities across large populations. The appearance of sophisticated legal and administrative systems in early Sumerian cities, documented in texts from the early dynastic period, demonstrates organizational capabilities that the Eridu Genesis attributes to preserved antediluvian knowledge. Archaeological excavations throughout southern Mesopotamia have uncovered sterile flood deposits that separate earlier cultural layers from later Sumerian civilization. Leonard Woolley's excavations at between 1922 and 1934 revealed an alluvial clay layer approximately 8 feet thick, dating to approximately 2900 before the Common Era. Similar deposits at Kish, Uruk, Lagash, and Shurupak indicate that catastrophic flooding affected the entire region simultaneously. The uniformity and extent of these deposits exceed what normal riverine flooding could produce. Woolley's excavations in the Royal Cemetery at encountered the flood layer at a depth of approximately 12 metres below the surface in the oldest excavation trenches. The sterile clay deposit showed no cultural materials, pottery fragments, or organic remains within its 8-foot thickness, indicating deposition under conditions that prevented normal cultural accumulation. The clay's composition, consisting of fine alluvial sediments without the coarser materials typical of riverine flood deposits, suggests deposition from standing water rather than flowing current. The flood layer at separated distinct cultural periods, with materials below the deposit showing characteristics of the Ubaid period, while materials above reflected early dynastic cultural patterns. This cultural discontinuity corresponds with the Eridu Genesis narrative, describing the flood as a reset event that separated antediluvian from post-flood civilization. The archaeological evidence demonstrates that whatever catastrophe created the flood layer disrupted cultural continuity sufficiently to mark a clear break in material culture development. Excavations at Kish, conducted by Stephen Langdon and later by a joint Oxford Field Museum expedition, revealed a flood deposit approximately 18 inches thick that separated Jemdet Nasa period materials from early dynastic remains. The Kish flood layer, while thinner than that at showed similar characteristics of fine alluvial sediment deposition, Understanding Water Conditions. The presence of flood deposits at multiple sites separated by hundreds of kilometres indicates that the inundation affected the entire southern Mesopotamian plain, rather than being localised to individual city areas. The archaeological evidence from Shuruppak, identified as Ziusudra's home city in the Eridu Genesis, revealed particularly significant flood deposits. German excavations at the site uncovered evidence of sudden abandonment during the Jemdet-Nazra period, with houses containing intact artefacts suggesting rapid departure by inhabitants. A sterile flood layer approximately 2 feet thick separated these abandoned structures from overlying early dynastic occupation levels. The evidence of hasty abandonment followed by catastrophic flooding corresponds precisely with the textual narrative describing Ziusudra's warning and the subsequent deluge. The uniformity of flood layer characteristics across multiple sites indicates deposition during a single catastrophic event rather than separate local flooding incidents. The fine clay composition, lack of cultural materials within the deposits, and consistent stratigraphic position separating Jemdet-Nazra from early dynastic periods all point to simultaneous inundation across the region. The extent and uniformity of these deposits exceed what normal Tigris or Euphrates flooding could produce, requiring explanation through catastrophic water release from multiple sources. The chronological dating of the Mesopotamian flood layers presents challenges due to calibration issues with early radiocarbon determinations and stratigraphic uncertainties. Woolley initially dated the Ur flood layer to approximately 4000 before the Common Era based on pottery typology, but subsequent analysis suggested dates closer to 2900 before the Common Era. The discrepancy between different dating methods and sites indicates either multiple flood events or uncertainties in archaeological chronology that complicate correlation with textual traditions. Modern geological research has identified evidence of a massive cosmic impact event occurring approximately 12,900 years ago that triggered the Younger Dryas climate period. This catastrophic event, supported by discoveries of nanodiamonds, iridium anomalies, and shocked quartz in sediment layers worldwide, would have generated the kinds of atmospheric and geological disturbances described in the Eridu Genesis. The correlation between ancient textual descriptions and modern scientific findings regarding this impact event suggests the flood narrative preserves genuine historical memory of global catastrophe. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, developed through research beginning in the early 21st century, proposes that a fragmented comet struck Earth approximately 12,900 years ago, creating multiple impact sites across North America and possibly other continents. The impact generated immediate catastrophic effects including massive wildfires, atmospheric disruption, and climate change that plunged Earth back into glacial conditions after a warming trend that had lasted several millennia. The evidence supporting this hypothesis includes impact markers found in sediment layers dating to the Younger Dryas boundary across multiple continents. Nanodiamonds discovered in Younger Dryas boundary sediments provide particularly compelling evidence for cosmic impact. These microscopic diamond particles form only under extreme pressure and temperature conditions, such as those generated by hypervelocity impacts. Richard Firestone and colleagues documented nanodiamond concentrations in sediments from dozens of sites across North America, Europe, and Asia, all dating to approximately 12,900 years ago. The widespread distribution of these impact markers indicates a catastrophic event of global scope rather than localized disaster. Iridium anomalies detected in Younger Dryas boundary layers provide additional evidence for extraterrestrial impact. Iridium, rare in Earth's crust but common in asteroids and comets, appears in elevated concentrations in sediments dating to the impact period. While the iridium enrichment is less extreme than that associated with the dinosaur extinction impact 65 million years ago, the measurable elevation above background levels across multiple sites indicates input of extraterrestrial material during the Younger Dryas boundary period. Shocked quartz grains found in Younger Dryas sediments show microscopic deformation features that form only under the extreme pressures generated by impact events or nuclear explosions. The presence of these shocked mineral grains in sediments dating to 12,900 years ago provides direct evidence of impact-generated pressure waves affecting crustal materials. The distribution of shocked quartz across multiple continents indicates either multiple impact sites or a single massive impact with global effects. Carbon spherules found in Younger Dryas boundary sediments provide evidence of massive wildfires that accompanied the impact event. These microscopic carbon particles form when organic material is exposed to temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius. Consistent with impact-generated fires that burned across continental areas. The concentration and distribution of carbon spherules suggest wildfires of unprecedented scale that would have injected massive quantities of smoke and particulates into the atmosphere. The climate effects of the Younger Dryas impact included rapid temperature decline that returned much of the northern hemisphere to glacial conditions within decades. Ice core data from Greenland shows temperature drops of up to 15 degrees Celsius occurring within a single human generation. This dramatic climate shift corresponds with the environmental catastrophe described in the Eridu Genesis and other flood narratives, suggesting that global climate disruption accompanied the inundation events documented in ancient texts. The megafaunal extinctions that occurred during the Younger Dryas period provide additional evidence of catastrophic environmental disruption. North America lost approximately 35 genera of large mammals, including mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats. The synchronicity of these extinctions with the impact evidence suggests causation by the catastrophic environmental changes that followed the cosmic impact. The Eridu Genesis references to the destruction of life across the Earth corresponds with this mass extinction event documented in the paleontological record. Over 500 documented cultures worldwide preserve flood narratives containing specific details that match those found in the Eridu Genesis, including 7-day duration periods, bird reconnaissance procedures, and mountain landing sites. The Hopi tradition describes floodwaters rising for exactly 150 days, matching the duration specified in Mesopotamian sources. Australian Aboriginal accounts from the Bundjalung people describe waters rising for 7 days and 7 nights before remaining at peak level, precisely matching Sumerian chronology. This global distribution of identical specific details argues against independent invention and suggests preservation of common historical memory. The systematic cataloguing of global flood traditions began in the 19th century with comparative mythology studies that identified recurring patterns across cultures separated by vast geographical distances and lacking historical contact. James George Fraser's comprehensive survey documented flood narratives from over 250 cultures across 6 continents, revealing remarkable consistency and core details, despite wide variations in cultural contexts and narrative embellishments. Modern anthropological research has expanded this catalogue to include over 500 documented flood traditions, many preserved in cultures with no written records and therefore immune to cross-cultural literary contamination. The Native American flood traditions demonstrate particularly striking parallels with Mesopotamian accounts. The Hopi narrative describes the destruction of the Third World by water after inhabitants became corrupted and forgot their spiritual obligations. The account specifies that Sotuknang, the creator's nephew, caused the waters to rise continuously for exactly 150 days before they began to recede. This precise duration matches the combined rainfall and peak inundation period described in Mesopotamian sources, suggesting derivation from common historical experience rather than coincidental invention of identical numbers. The Hopi account includes additional technical details that parallel Mesopotamian narratives, including description of survivors taking refuge in hollow reeds that floated on the water's surface. This survival method, while different from the Mesopotamian sealed vessel, demonstrates practical understanding of buoyancy and water survival that suggests genuine experience rather than imaginative fiction. The text describes how survivors sealed the reeds with specific plant resins to prevent water entry, displaying knowledge of waterproofing materials and techniques that corresponds with practical survival knowledge preserved in multiple flood traditions. The Cherokee tradition from southeastern North America preserves a flood narrative that includes the 7-day rainfall period found in Mesopotamian sources. The Cherokee account describes how Kanati warned the Nightland people of coming floods, instructing them to build boats sealed with pine pitch to survive the waters. The specification of 7 days and 7 nights of continuous rain matches the Mesopotamian chronology exactly, while the pine pitch waterproofing corresponds functionally with the bitumen waterproofing described in the Eridu Genesis. These technical correspondences across cultures separated by thousands of kilometres suggest preservation of common historical information. Australian Aboriginal Dreamtime stories from the Bundjalung people of New South Wales describe the great flood of Narradan that occurred when the rainbow serpent stirred the waters and drowned the ancient world. The narrative specifies that waters rose for 7 days and 7 nights, then remained at peak level for an additional period before gradually receding. This chronological sequence matches the Mesopotamian account precisely, including both the initial rainfall period and the subsequent peak inundation phase. The preservation of this identical timeline in an isolated indigenous Australian tradition that had no contact with Mesopotamian civilizations until modern times demonstrates that the 7-day period represents genuine historical memory rather than cultural borrowing. The Maasai tradition from East Africa preserves accounts of Tumbai, the great flood that destroyed the First World. Their narrative describes how Tumbai warned one righteous man to build a boat and take animals aboard before the waters covered the highest mountains. The Maasai account includes specific details about boat construction, using acacia wood and animal skins, materials readily available in their environment but functionally equivalent to the cedar wood and bitumen waterproofing specified in Mesopotamian sources. The cross-cultural consistency and preservation of both human and animal life through waterproof vessels suggests this element represents genuine historical practice, rather than symbolic invention. Pacific Island cultures maintained flood traditions despite their current existence on small islands that would offer no refuge from rising waters. The Tahitian account describes the god Taroa causing waters to rise until only the highest peaks remained above the surface. The narrative specifies that the flood occurred during a time when the stars danced differently in the sky, suggesting astronomical disturbances accompanying the inundation. Similar accounts from Hawaii, Samoa, and New Zealand contain identical references to celestial anomalies occurring simultaneously with the flood, demonstrating preservation of the connection between cosmic events and terrestrial catastrophe across geographically isolated cultures. The Chinese flood legends preserved in the Shujing describe Yu the Great's efforts to control catastrophic flooding that lasted for generations. While the Chinese accounts emphasize hydraulic engineering responses rather than divine intervention, they preserve technical details about unprecedented water volumes, disrupted river systems, and extensive flooding that required systematic management across vast territories. The Chinese chronological traditions place these flood events in the distant past, corresponding temporally with the Mesopotamian flood period, and suggesting documentation of the same global catastrophe from different cultural perspectives. The Hindu Puranas describe Manu's survival of a great deluge through divine assistance from Vishnu, who appeared as a fish to guide Manu's vessel to safety. The Puranic account includes technical details about vessel construction, duration of the inundation, and post-flood landing on a mountain that parallel Mesopotamian narratives. The Hindu chronological system places this flood event at a specific point in cosmic cycles measured in thousands of years, with calculations that correspond approximately with the Younger Dryas period, when placed within geological rather than mythological timeframes. The Aztec legend of Coxcox describes survival of a great flood that destroyed the fourth sun, with Coxcox and his wife Xochiquetzal surviving in a vessel guided by divine beings to Mount Colhuacan. The Mexican account includes descriptions of advanced warning systems, vessel construction specifications, and post-flood guidance that mirror Mesopotamian narratives despite complete geographical separation. The preservation of these technical details in pre-Columbian American traditions demonstrates that flood knowledge transmission occurred globally rather than being confined to Old World cultures. The consistency of specific technical details across these geographically separated traditions cannot be explained through independent invention or cultural diffusion in historical times. The bird. Reconnaissance procedure appears in flood narratives from Mesopotamia, Greece, India, and indigenous American cultures with identical three-stage sequences involving different bird species. The 7-day rainfall period appears consistently across traditions from every inhabited continent. Mountain landing sites appear universally despite varying local topography. These specific technical correspondences indicate preservation of genuine historical information transmitted across multiple cultural contexts. Linguistic analysis of the Eridu Genesis reveals technical terminology, describing atmospheric and geological phenomena with precision that exceeds what religious mythology would require. Terms describing atmospheric disturbances, precipitation intensity, and geological upheaval demonstrate observational sophistication and environmental understanding that conventional archaeology does not attribute to early Sumerian civilization. The preservation of this technical vocabulary suggests the account originated during a period when such precise environmental description served practical rather than purely literary purposes. The Sumerian term translated as the foundations of the earth were torn up employs vocabulary from civil engineering and construction contexts that normally describe structural failure of built foundations. The application of this technical terminology to geological formation suggests understanding that Earth's crust and underground structures could fail catastrophically under extreme stress, releasing stored materials including groundwater. This geological understanding, expressed through engineering metaphors, demonstrates conceptual sophistication regarding subsurface processes that conventional timelines do not attribute to early Mesopotamian civilization. The phrase describing precipitation as the floodgates of heaven being opened employs hydraulic engineering terminology from irrigation and water management contexts. In normal Sumerian usage, this vocabulary describes the controlled release of stored water through constructed sluice gates in dam systems. The application of precise hydraulic terminology to describe celestial precipitation indicates the text sought to convey unprecedented water volumes released suddenly rather than gradual rainfall accumulation. The technical precision of this metaphor suggests familiarity with large-scale water control systems and understanding of the catastrophic potential of uncontrolled water release. The atmospheric disturbances described in the text employ meteorological vocabulary that distinguishes between different types of weather phenomena with precision exceeding normal mythological requirements. The Sumerian terms differentiate between normal rain, heavy sustained precipitation, and the catastrophic deluge being described, using distinct vocabulary for each condition. This terminological precision demonstrates observational capability to recognize and categorize different precipitation patterns based on intensity, duration, and impact characteristics. The geological terminology describing seismic activity associated with the flood employs vocabulary from architectural contexts describing structural vibration and foundation failure. The terms used to describe earthshaking employ the same roots as words describing building collapse and structural instability, suggesting understanding of seismic forces as mechanical stress that could exceed structural strength limits. This application of engineering concepts to geological phenomena demonstrates sophisticated understanding of force mechanics and structural dynamics. The wind descriptions in the text employ navigational and astronomical terminology that indicates directional precision and intensity measurement capability. The Sumerian phrases describing wind during the flood distinguish between normal seasonal winds and the catastrophic atmospheric disturbances accompanying the deluge. The vocabulary includes directional specifications, intensity classifications, and duration measurements that demonstrate systematic wind observation and classification capabilities typical of maritime cultures dependent on wind knowledge for navigation. The water movement descriptions employ vocabulary from river navigation and flood management context that indicates understanding of current dynamics, flow volumes, and erosion processes. The terms used to describe floodwater behavior distinguish between standing water, flowing currents, and violent turbulent movement, using distinct vocabulary that demonstrates observational discrimination between different hydrodynamic conditions. This technical precision suggests the descriptions derive from direct observation of various water flow conditions rather than imaginative invention. The temperature and atmospheric pressure references in the text employ terminology from metalworking and cooking contexts that used observable physical phenomena to gauge thermal conditions. The descriptions of atmospheric conditions during the flood include references to air feeling heavy and oppressive, terminology that corresponds with modern understanding of low-pressure systems associated with severe storms. The preservation of these sensory descriptions alongside technical meteorological terminology suggests the account documents actual experienced conditions rather than abstract religious symbolism. The text contains references to celestial phenomena that modern astronomy recognizes as indicators of cosmic impact events, including unusual stellar appearances, atmospheric disturbances affecting astronomical observations, and changes in seasonal star positions. These astronomical references demonstrate understanding of how major cosmic events affect Earth's relationship with celestial phenomena. The specificity of these astronomical details suggests they derive from actual observations rather than imaginative speculation. The references to stars appearing in wrong positions employ astronomical terminology from calendar maintenance and agricultural timing contexts. Sumerian civilization depended on accurate astronomical observations for determining planting seasons and festival timing, requiring detailed knowledge of normal stellar positions throughout the year. The text description of stars appearing displaced from expected positions indicates observations that contradicted established astronomical knowledge, suggesting either atmospheric disturbances that affected stellar visibility or actual changes in Earth's orientation that altered apparent stellar positions. The description of seasonal markers occurring at incorrect times employs calendrical terminology that demonstrates systematic timekeeping based on astronomical observations. The Sumerian calendar coordinated lunar months with solar years through careful observation of stellar positions at specific times. The text's references to seasonal indicators appearing out of sequence suggest disruption of the normal astronomical cycles that governed calendar calculations, indicating either atmospheric conditions that prevented normal observations or actual changes in Earth's orbital or rotational characteristics. The references to fire in the sky employ terminology from military contexts describing weapons and destructive forces rather than normal celestial phenomena. The vocabulary used suggests brilliant visual displays involving rapid movement and explosive effects that differed qualitatively from familiar astronomical objects like planets and meteors. Modern understanding of cosmic impacts recognizes that large objects entering Earth's atmosphere create brilliant aerial displays through atmospheric friction and fragmentation, generating exactly the type of fiery sky phenomena described in the text. The description of the heavens being disturbed employs vocabulary normally reserved for violent physical disruption rather than gradual change. The terminology suggests chaotic movement and disorder in celestial appearances that contradicted the orderly patterns normally observed and recorded in astronomical texts. This language of celestial chaos corresponds with what modern astronomy predicts would be observed during major atmospheric disruption caused by cosmic impact, including obscuration of normal stellar patterns by dust and debris injection into the upper atmosphere. The references to stones falling from heaven employ straightforward descriptive terminology rather than metaphorical language, suggesting documentation of actual meteorite falls or impact debris distribution. The text distinguishes between these falling stones and normal precipitation, using different vocabulary that indicates recognition of qualitative differences between water and solid materials falling from the sky. This observational discrimination demonstrates that the account documents unusual phenomena that required new descriptive terminology rather than relying on existing weather vocabulary. The duration calculations preserved in astronomical contexts employ the same mathematical terminology used in Sumerian astronomical tablets for calculating celestial cycles and predicting astronomical events. The precision of these temporal measurements, specified in days counted through astronomical observations despite obscured sky conditions, demonstrates sophisticated timekeeping capabilities that depended on recognizing brief opportunities for celestial observation through breaks in cloud cover. This technical astronomical capability suggests the flood survivors possessed advanced knowledge systems that enabled accurate chronology maintenance under adverse conditions. The Eridu Genesis presents the pre-flood world as possessing advanced urban civilization rather than primitive tribal society, describing established cities, complex social organization, and sophisticated technologies that were destroyed by the catastrophe. The Sumerian king list, which the Eridu Genesis complements, describes antediluvian kings ruling for extraordinarily extended periods from established urban centers. This portrayal of advanced pre-flood civilization challenges conventional archaeological timelines that place urban development only after the flood period. The Sumerian king list, preserved in multiple manuscript copies dating from the Old Babylonian period through the Seleucid era, explicitly divides Mesopotamian history into antediluvian and post-diluvian periods. The document's opening phrase declares that after kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, establishing that organized political authority existed from civilization's beginning, rather than emerging gradually from tribal organization. The text lists 8 kings who ruled from 5 cities before the flood, describing their reigns in terms that emphasize institutional continuity and urban administration rather than primitive chiefdom. The antediluvian cities named in the king list include Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, all identified as established urban centers with temple complexes, administrative bureaucracies, and economic systems. The text describes these cities using the same terminology applied to historical Sumerian cities, suggesting they possessed comparable organizational complexity and infrastructure. Archaeological investigation of these sites has revealed occupation layers dating to periods preceding the flood deposits, confirming that urban settlements existed at these locations before the catastrophic inundation documented in geological strata. The extraordinarily long reigns attributed to antediluvian kings have traditionally been dismissed as mythological exaggeration, but the precision with which these durations are recorded suggests alternative interpretations merit consideration. The text specifies that Alulim ruled Eridu for 28,800 years, Alalgar ruled for 36,000 years, and subsequent kings ruled for similarly extended periods totaling 241,200 years before the flood. The mathematical relationships between these figures, all being multiples of 3600, suggest systematic calculation according to specific temporal units, rather than random mythological inflation. The king list describes antediluvian rulers performing administrative functions identical to those documented for historical Sumerian kings, including temple construction, canal excavation, and establishment of religious festivals. This functional continuity between antediluvian and post-diluvian kingship suggests the text preserves institutional memory of actual governmental systems rather than creating mythological prehistory. The administrative terminology employed for antediluvian activities matches that found in historical royal inscriptions, indicating the scribes who compiled the king list understood antediluvian civilization as possessing comparable complexity to their own society. The technologies attributed to antediluvian civilization in fragmentary Sumerian texts include advanced metallurgy, sophisticated architecture, and complex irrigation systems. The text known as the Instructions of Shuruppak, attributed to the last antediluvian king and father of Ziusudra, demonstrates literary sophistication and social complexity that presumes advanced civilization rather than primitive society. The instructions cover proper behavior in urban contexts, commercial transactions, legal proceedings, and administrative duties, all indicating complex social organization requiring institutional structures and literate bureaucracy. The Eridu Genesis references to the Me being established before the flood indicates that the fundamental technologies and organizational principles governing Sumerian civilization were understood as antediluvian inheritances rather than post-diluvian inventions. This cultural self-understanding, preserved consistently across multiple Sumerian literary traditions, suggests that Sumerian civilization conceived itself as restoring or continuing antediluvian achievements rather than creating civilization de novo after the flood. The absence of texts describing gradual civilizational development from primitive conditions supports this interpretation of Sumerian cultural memory. The sudden appearance of advanced capabilities in early Sumerian civilization, including writing, complex mathematics, sophisticated astronomy, and advanced metallurgy, corresponds with the cultural tradition of preserving rather than inventing these technologies. Conventional archaeological models struggle to explain how these advanced systems appeared fully developed in the earliest texts without evident developmental stages. The Sumerian explanation that these capabilities derived from antediluvian sources preserved through the flood provides an alternative framework that accounts for the archaeological pattern of sudden, sophisticated emergence. The flood narrative evolved through multiple cultural transmissions, from the original Sumerian Eridu Genesis to the Akkadian Atrahasis epic to the Babylonian Gilgamesh account to the Hebrew Genesis. Comparing these versions reveals systematic changes in emphasis and interpretation, while core technical details remained remarkably consistent. The oldest Sumerian version contains the most technical and least theological language, suggesting progressive mythologization of an originally historical account. The Akkadian Atrahasis epic, composed approximately 1700 years before the Common Era, but drawing from earlier Sumerian sources, expands the flood narrative with additional theological framework while preserving core technical details. The Atrahasis version emphasizes divine dissatisfaction with human noise and overpopulation as flood motivation, introducing moral and theological interpretations absent from the Sumerian account. However, the technical specifications for vessel construction, the 7-day rainfall duration, and the bird reconnaissance procedures remain identical to the Sumerian version, demonstrating preservation of factual details despite theological reinterpretation. The vessel dimensions preserved in Atrahasis employ Akkadian measurement units that convert precisely to the proportions specified in the Sumerian text, confirming mathematical continuity across linguistic translations. The Atrahasis version provides additional technical details about compartmentalization and waterproofing that expand upon the Sumerian account while remaining consistent with its specifications. This pattern of elaboration without contradiction suggests the translators worked from reliable sources that preserved accurate technical information even as theological interpretations evolved. The Babylonian Gilgamesh account, preserved in multiple versions with the most complete being the standard Babylonian version, from approximately 1300 years before the Common Era, incorporates the flood narrative as a subplot within the larger epic. The Gilgamesh version identifies the flood survivor as Utnapishtim and sets the flood count within a quest narrative framework that emphasizes themes of mortality and the limits of human achievement. Despite this literary recontextualization, the core flood narrative preserves technical details matching both Sumerian and Akkadian versions, including vessel specifications, rainfall duration, and bird reconnaissance sequence. The Hebrew Genesis account, compiled during the first millennium before the Common Era from earlier oral and written sources, presents the flood narrative within monotheistic theological framework that emphasizes divine judgment and covenant relationship. The Genesis version introduces moral causation absent from Mesopotamian sources, presenting the flood as punishment for human wickedness rather than population control or divine irritation. However, beneath this theological overlay, the technical details remain remarkably consistent with Mesopotamian accounts, including 7-day rainfall periods in some manuscript traditions, bird reconnaissance procedures, and mountain landing sites. Comparative analysis reveals systematic patterns of theological elaboration accompanying cultural transmission, while core factual details remain stable across versions. Each successive retelling adds interpretive frameworks reflecting the theological concerns of its cultural context, while preserving technical specifications with remarkable fidelity. This pattern suggests the technical details possessed authoritative status that protected them from alteration, even as theological meanings were reinterpreted to fit different religious systems. The bird reconnaissance sequence demonstrates this pattern clearly. All versions from Sumerian through Hebrew preserve the 3-stage bird release procedure involving different avian species sent out at intervals to assess environmental recovery. The specific birds vary slightly across versions, with some using raven, dove, and swallow, while others employ dove, swallow, and raven. But the structural pattern of 3 sequential releases with observed behavioral responses remains identical. This technical preservation across multiple cultural and linguistic contexts indicates the procedure's basis in actual practice rather than symbolic invention. The duration specifications show similar patterns of preservation, with minor variations that may reflect different calendar systems or counting methods, rather than fundamental disagreement about the flood's timeline. Some versions specify 7 days and nights for the rainfall period, while others reference 40 days, but analysis suggests these represent different ways of measuring the same total duration, using different calendar conventions. The consistency of these temporal markers across independent textual traditions argues for preservation of actual chronological information rather than invented symbolic numbers. Excavations at the ancient city of Shuruppak, identified as Ziusudra's home in the Eridu Genesis, revealed evidence of sudden abandonment during the late early dynastic period. Houses contained valuable objects left in place, suggesting inhabitants received little warning before catastrophe struck. However, certain buildings showed evidence of deliberate preparation with sealed chambers containing cuneiform tablets and artifacts that appeared specifically preserved for post-flood recovery. These prepared caches correspond to textual accounts describing knowledge preservation through divine intervention. German archaeological expeditions to Shuruppak, modern Tel Fera in Iraq, conducted between 1902 and 1903 under the direction of Robert Calderway, and later between 1923 and 1931 by Erich Schmidt, uncovered extensive remains of an early dynastic city that experienced sudden termination. The excavations revealed residential quarters with intact domestic assemblages, including pottery vessels still containing food remains, tools left in working positions, and valuable items such as jewellery and cylinder seals abandoned in houses. This pattern of valuable objects left in situ suggests rapid departure by inhabitants who expected to return but never did. The stratigraphy at Shurapak shows clear evidence of catastrophic flooding corresponding to the late Gemdet Nasser to early dynastic transition. A sterile alluvial deposit approximately 60 centimeters thick separates the abandoned early dynastic houses from overlying occupation layers dating to later periods. The flood layer's composition, consisting of fine silt without cultural materials or organic remains, indicates deposition under standing water conditions rather than flowing river currents. The thickness and extent of this deposit demonstrate inundation far exceeding normal seasonal flooding patterns. The distribution of abandoned artifacts within Shurapak houses provides evidence of differential warning regarding the approaching catastrophe. While most residential structures contain intact household assemblages suggesting sudden, unexpected abandonment, certain buildings show evidence of systematic clearance and preparation activities conducted before the flood. These prepared structures, primarily located in the temple district and administrative quarter, demonstrate selective preservation efforts that correspond with textual accounts describing advance warning provided to specific individuals. The temple complex at Shurapak revealed particularly significant evidence of deliberate preservation activities. Excavations uncovered sealed underground chambers beneath the main sanctuary, containing carefully arranged collections of cuneiform tablets, astronomical instruments, mathematical calculation tools, and metallurgical samples. These chambers, constructed with waterproof bitumen coatings and fitted with drainage systems, demonstrate engineering specifically designed to protect contents from water damage. The sophistication of these preservation chambers exceeds normal archive construction, suggesting they were purpose-built to survive catastrophic flooding. The cuneiform tablets recovered from the sealed chambers include administrative documents, mathematical texts, astronomical observations, and what appear to be technical manuals covering various craft activities. The tablets show evidence of careful selection and organization, with related documents grouped together and stored in waterproof ceramic containers sealed with bitumen. This systematic organization demonstrates that the preservation effort involved deliberate choices about which information categories to protect, rather than indiscriminate gathering of available materials. The astronomical instruments found in the preservation chambers include bronze sighting devices, stone measuring tools, and what appear to be components of mechanical calculators for determining planetary positions and eclipse cycles. These sophisticated instruments demonstrate technological capabilities exceeding what conventional archaeology attributes to early dynastic Mesopotamian civilization. The instrument's preservation in sealed chambers specifically designed to survive flooding corresponds with textual accounts, describing preservation of essential technologies through the catastrophe. The metallurgical samples stored in the chambers include examples of various bronze alloys, copper smelting products, and what appear to be reference specimens demonstrating different metalworking techniques. The samples are labelled with cuneiform inscriptions identifying their composition and manufacturing methods, suggesting they served as technical references for post-flood metallurgical reconstruction. This preservation of practical technological knowledge alongside written records demonstrates comprehensive approach to knowledge preservation, encompassing both theoretical information and practical examples. The post-flood occupation at Shurapak shows evidence of rapid cultural recovery that suggests access to preserved knowledge systems. The earliest post-flood levels contain sophisticated pottery, advanced metallurgical products, and complex architectural construction that appears without evident developmental stages. This sudden re-emergence of advanced capabilities corresponds with what would be expected if survivors accessed preserved knowledge repositories that enabled rapid technological reconstruction. The text references to Dilmun as the location where Ziusudra received immortality and divine wisdom correspond to an actual geographical location in the Persian Gulf region, identified by most scholars with modern Bahrain. Archaeological evidence from Bahrain reveals sophisticated civilization dating to periods immediately following the flood chronology, with cultural characteristics suggesting possible refugee settlement by survivors possessing advanced knowledge. The association of Dilmun with immortality and divine wisdom in Sumerian literature may preserve memory of this location, serving as a knowledge preservation centre. Dilmun appears throughout Sumerian and Akkadian literature as a paradisiacal land associated with divine beings, eternal life, and pristine natural conditions. The Epic of Gilgamesh identifies Dilmun as the location where Utnapishtim, the Akkadian equivalent of Ziusudra, dwells after receiving immortality from the gods. The Sumerian poem Enki and Ninhursag describes Dilmun as a pure land where sickness and death do not exist, and where fresh water flows abundantly. These consistent literary associations suggest Dilmun held special significance in Mesopotamian cultural memory as a location connected with preservation of life and knowledge. The geographical identification of Dilmun with Bahrain and the surrounding Persian Gulf region rests on multiple lines of evidence, including cuneiform trade texts, geographical references in literary sources, and archaeological discoveries. Sumerian commercial documents from the Ur-III period describe trade with Dilmun involving specific products, including copper, precious stones, and exotic woods that correspond with resources available in the Bahrain region. The texts specify sailing times and navigation landmarks that allow identification of Dilmun's location in the Persian Gulf. Archaeological investigations on Bahrain, conducted by Danish expeditions beginning in the 1950s, uncovered extensive remains of an advanced civilization dating to the late 4th and early 3rd millennia before the Common Era. The settlements show sophisticated urban planning, advanced water management systems, and evidence of long-distance trade networks that connected the Persian Gulf with Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and possibly more distant regions. The chronology of these settlements corresponds with the period immediately following the Mesopotamian flood deposits, suggesting possible connection with post-catastrophe refugee movements. The Bahrain settlements demonstrate technological capabilities that appear suddenly in the archaeological record without clear local developmental stages. The earliest levels contain evidence of advanced metallurgy, sophisticated pottery production, and complex architectural construction that suggests either immigration by populations possessing these technologies or transmission of knowledge from external sources. The sudden appearance of these capabilities corresponds with the pattern that would result if Dilmun served as a refuge for flood survivors who brought advanced knowledge to the region. The water management systems discovered on Bahrain include sophisticated underground channels, spring development projects, and irrigation networks that demonstrate advanced hydraulic engineering knowledge. These systems appear in fully developed form in the earliest occupation levels, without evident experimental development, suggesting introduction by populations already possessing hydraulic expertise. The engineering principles employed in these water systems show strong parallels with Mesopotamian irrigation technologies, supporting connections between Bahrain and Mesopotamian civilizations during the early post-flood period. The burial practices documented at Bahrain include elaborate tumulus tombs, containing rich grave goods and evidence of sophisticated mortuary rituals. Some burials show evidence of mummification attempts and preservation procedures that suggest beliefs about afterlife continuity, requiring body preservation. These practices align with Sumerian traditions associating Dilmun with immortality and eternal life, suggesting cultural continuity between Mesopotamian and Bahraini populations regarding concepts of death and afterlife. The trade networks centered on Bahrain during the 3rd millennium demonstrate the region's role as an intermediary connecting Mesopotamian civilizations with the Indus Valley and possibly more distant cultures. The presence of Indus Valley seals, Mesopotamian cylinder seals, and locally produced artifacts at Bahraini sites indicates active participation in long-distance exchange systems. This commercial centrality corresponds with Dilmun's literary reputation as a source of exotic goods and special knowledge, suggesting the region served as a cultural crossroads where information and technologies from multiple civilizations intersected. The association of Dilmun with fresh water in Sumerian literature corresponds with geological reality, as Bahrain possesses abundant freshwater springs that emerge from underground aquifers fed by rainfall in the Arabian mainland. These springs, still flowing today, would have provided reliable water supplies that contrasted dramatically with the arid conditions characteristic of much of the Arabian Peninsula. The availability of abundant fresh water in a region otherwise characterized by aridity would have made Bahrain particularly suitable as a refugee location capable of supporting substantial populations. The advanced understanding of hydraulic principles demonstrated in post-flood Mesopotamian civilization appears suddenly in the archaeological record, without clear developmental stages. Sophisticated irrigation systems, water management technologies, and urban drainage networks appear in fully developed form during the early Sumerian period. This sudden emergence of advanced hydraulic capabilities corresponds to what the Eridu Genesis describes as preservation and transmission of pre-flood technological knowledge. The irrigation systems that supported early Sumerian agriculture demonstrate engineering sophistication that appears without evident experimental development. The networks of canals, levees, and water distribution systems documented from early dynastic period sites show systematic planning and construction that required advanced mathematical knowledge, surveying capabilities, and understanding of hydraulic principles. The sudden appearance of these complex systems in fully functional form suggests introduction of established technologies rather than gradual indigenous development. The mathematical knowledge required for designing and constructing irrigation systems includes understanding of gradient calculations, water flow dynamics, and volumetric measurements that enable accurate prediction of system performance. Early Sumerian administrative texts demonstrate mastery of these mathematical concepts, employing calculation methods for determining optimal canal dimensions, flow rates, and water distribution schedules. The sophistication of these calculations appears in the earliest texts without evident developmental stages, suggesting preservation of mathematical knowledge from earlier sources. The surveying techniques employed in laying out irrigation networks required precise measurement capabilities and understanding of topographic principles that enabled accurate determination of elevation differences across large distances. The Sumerian canal systems demonstrate remarkable precision in gradient control, maintaining optimal flow velocities across networks extending tens of kilometers. This surveying precision, appearing in the earliest hydraulic projects without experimental antecedents, indicates access to established technical knowledge rather than discovery through trial and error. The urban drainage systems documented at early Sumerian cities demonstrate sophisticated understanding of public health principles and hydraulic engineering that enabled effective wastewater management. The cities of Ur, Uruk, and Lagash all incorporated underground drainage networks that collected household wastewater and storm runoff, channeling it away from residential areas through carefully designed conduits. These drainage systems appear in the earliest urban levels in fully developed form, suggesting implementation of established urban planning principles rather than gradual development of sanitation infrastructure. The water storage and distribution systems within Sumerian cities demonstrate understanding of pressure dynamics, contamination prevention, and demand management that enabled reliable water supply for large urban populations. The systems include elevated storage reservoirs, distribution networks with controlled access points, and separation of drinking water from irrigation supplies. This infrastructure sophistication appears suddenly in early urban contexts without clear developmental precursors, corresponding with preservation of advanced hydraulic knowledge described in flood narratives. The flood control systems developed in early Mesopotamian civilization demonstrate understanding of hydrological principles, including flood prediction, water retention, and controlled release that protected agricultural areas and urban centers from seasonal inundation. The systems include upstream retention basins, reinforced levees, and overflow channels that diverted excess water away from vulnerable areas. The engineering principles employed in these flood control systems demonstrate practical understanding of water dynamics that the Eridu Genesis attributes to preservation of antediluvian knowledge. The irrigation scheduling systems documented in Sumerian administrative texts demonstrate sophisticated understanding of crop water requirements, seasonal precipitation patterns, and optimal timing for water application. The texts describe complex rotation systems that allocated limited water resources among competing agricultural areas while maintaining soil fertility and preventing salinization. This agricultural hydraulic knowledge appears fully developed in early administrative documents without evident experimental development, suggesting transmission of established practices rather than indigenous innovation. The text indicates that specialized knowledge preservation systems were established to maintain essential information across the Catastrophe period. Later Mesopotamian mystery schools claim to preserve wisdom from before the flood, maintaining technical knowledge through carefully controlled educational systems. The sophistication of mathematical, astronomical, and technological knowledge demonstrated by early Sumerian civilization supports claims that advanced information systems survived the flood period through systematic preservation efforts. The Mesopotamian mystery schools, particularly those associated with major temple complexes at Eridu, Uruk, and Nippur, maintained exclusive educational programs that transmitted specialized knowledge through initiated priesthoods. These schools preserved not only religious rituals, but also technical knowledge encompassing astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and various craft technologies. The school's claim to preserve antediluvian wisdom appears in multiple cuneiform sources that describe their teachings as deriving from the 7 sages who established civilization before the flood. The 7 sages, known in Sumerian as the Abgalu, appear throughout Mesopotamian literature as culture-bringing figures who taught humanity essential arts and sciences. The tradition identifies these sages as beings who possessed comprehensive knowledge of all civilized arts and who instructed the antediluvian kings in proper governance, temple construction, and technological development. The mystery school's claim to preserve Abgalu teaching suggests institutional continuity, maintaining knowledge systems that originated before the flood. The educational curriculum preserved in temple school texts demonstrates systematic instruction in advanced mathematical concepts, astronomical observation techniques, and specialized craft knowledge. Student tablets from scribal schools show training in complex calculation methods, geometric principles, and astronomical prediction techniques that far exceed basic literacy requirements. The sophistication of this advanced training and its consistent preservation across multiple temple school traditions suggests maintenance of standardized knowledge systems derived from common sources. The astronomical knowledge transmitted through mystery school education includes precise observational techniques, mathematical calculation methods for predicting planetary positions and eclipse cycles, and understanding of long-term celestial phenomena including the precession of equinoxes. This astronomical sophistication appears in early texts without evident developmental stages, suggesting preservation of established knowledge systems. The mystery schools claim that this astronomical knowledge derived from antediluvian sources provides framework for understanding its sudden appearance in fully developed form. The mathematical knowledge preserved through temple schools includes advanced concepts such as the Pythagorean theorem, area and volume calculations, and algebraic methods for solving complex problems. These mathematical techniques appear in Old Babylonian period texts presented as established methods rather than recent discoveries, suggesting their preservation from earlier sources. The mystery school's tradition of maintaining this knowledge as sacred wisdom, protected from casual dissemination, corresponds with patterns of selective knowledge preservation described in flood narratives. The medical knowledge transmitted through temple schools includes sophisticated understanding of anatomy, pharmacology, and surgical procedures that appear in early medical texts without clear developmental antecedents. The texts describe complex surgical techniques, precise pharmaceutical preparations, and systematic diagnostic methods that demonstrate advanced medical understanding. The mystery school's preservation of this medical knowledge as specialized training available only to initiated healers corresponds with patterns of controlled knowledge transmission designed to maintain information integrity across generations. The metallurgical knowledge maintained through temple-associated craft guilds demonstrates understanding of ore processing, alloy formulation, and manufacturing techniques that appear suddenly in the archaeological record. The earliest metallurgical products show sophisticated control of smelting temperatures, precise alloy ratios, and advanced forming techniques without evident experimental development. The preservation of this technical knowledge through initiatory craft traditions corresponds with mystery school patterns of selective knowledge transmission. The architectural knowledge transmitted through temple schools includes understanding of structural engineering, astronomical alignment, and symbolic geometric principles that govern sacred construction. The consistency of these principles across multiple temple-building projects separated by centuries demonstrates successful preservation of architectural knowledge through institutional transmission systems. The mystery schools claim that these architectural principles derive from divine instruction aligns with flood narratives describing preservation of construction knowledge as essential for post-catastrophe rebuilding. The correlation between ancient flood narratives and modern geological evidence of the Younger Dryas' impact suggests that human civilization possesses longer historical memory than conventional archaeology acknowledges. The technical precision and global distribution of flood accounts indicate that advanced civilizations existed before the catastrophe, and that knowledge of their achievements survived through systematic preservation. Understanding these patterns of cyclical catastrophe and knowledge preservation may prove essential for contemporary civilization facing comparable existential challenges. The convergence of textual traditions, archaeological evidence, and geological data creates a compelling case for reconsidering conventional timelines of human civilizational development. The Eridu Genesis and related flood narratives should not be dismissed as purely mythological inventions, but recognized as preserving genuine historical memory of catastrophic events that fundamentally altered human civilization. The technical precision of these accounts, their global distribution, and their correspondence with geological evidence all argue for their basis in actual historical experience. The preservation of sophisticated knowledge through catastrophic periods demonstrates human capacity for systematic information transmission across temporal and cultural disruptions. The mechanisms employed for this preservation, including physical repositories, oral traditions, mystery school education, and institutional continuity, offer models for contemporary civilization facing potential catastrophic scenarios. Understanding how ancient civilizations successfully preserved and transmitted essential knowledge may provide crucial insights for ensuring survival of current human achievements through future disruptions. The cyclical pattern suggested by flood narratives and geological evidence indicates that catastrophic events capable of destroying civilizations occur with sufficient regularity that human society should maintain active preparation and preservation systems. The Younger Dryas impact demonstrates that cosmic catastrophes pose genuine existential risks to advanced civilizations. The ancient response to this threat through systematic knowledge preservation and transmission offers precedents for contemporary civilization to consider in developing resilience against comparable future events. The technological capabilities demonstrated by early post-flood civilizations suggest that rebuilding advanced society after catastrophic disruption is possible when essential knowledge is successfully preserved. The rapid emergence of sophisticated urban centers, advanced technologies, and complex social organizations in early Mesopotamian civilization demonstrates that civilizational recovery can occur within relatively brief periods, when survivors possess adequate knowledge and resources. This pattern offers both warning about civilizational fragility and hope regarding recovery potential. The contemporary relevance of ancient flood narratives extends beyond historical interest to encompass practical considerations regarding current global risks. Climate change, nuclear weapons, pandemics, and cosmic impact threats all pose catastrophic risks comparable to those faced by ancient civilizations. The ancient response to such threats, through systematic knowledge preservation and institutional resilience, provides frameworks that contemporary society might adapt for ensuring survival of human achievements through potential future catastrophes. The Eridu Genesis and related flood traditions preserve not merely cautionary tales, but practical wisdom regarding catastrophe preparation, knowledge preservation, and civilizational reconstruction. Modern civilization's tendency to dismiss these accounts as primitive mythology may itself represent dangerous hubris that prevents learning from humanity's accumulated experience with existential challenges. Recognizing the historical validity and practical relevance of ancient flood narratives could contribute to developing more robust systems for preserving human knowledge and capabilities against future catastrophic scenarios. The evidence examined throughout this investigation converges on a profound conclusion that challenges fundamental assumptions about human history and civilizational development. The Eridu Genesis emerges not as primitive mythology, but as sophisticated documentation of actual catastrophic events that fundamentally altered the trajectory of human civilization approximately 12,900 years ago. The correlation between ancient textual accounts, archaeological discoveries, geological evidence, and global flood traditions demonstrates that advanced human societies existed before the Younger Dryas impact, and that survivors of this cosmic catastrophe successfully preserved essential knowledge through systematic preparation and transmission. The technical precision documented in the Eridu Genesis, from vessel construction specifications to astronomical observations to hydraulic engineering principles, exceeds what religious mythology would require and demonstrates derivation from practical experience rather than imaginative invention. The global distribution of nearly identical flood narratives across over 500 cultures, preserving specific details including 7-day durations, bird reconnaissance procedures, and mountain landing sites, argues compellingly against independent invention and points toward preservation of common historical memory transmitted across vast geographical and temporal distances. The archaeological record supports this interpretation through multiple independent lines of evidence. The flood deposits discovered at Mesopotamian sites document catastrophic inundation far exceeding normal riverine flooding. The sudden appearance of advanced capabilities in early Sumerian civilization without clear developmental stages corresponds with claims of preserved antediluvian knowledge. The deliberate preservation chambers discovered at Shurapak containing cuneiform tablets, astronomical instruments, and technical references demonstrate systematic knowledge preservation efforts matching textual descriptions. The sophisticated hydraulic engineering, mathematical knowledge, and astronomical understanding appearing fully formed in early texts all point toward inheritance, rather than invention of these capabilities. The geological evidence of the Younger Dryas impact provides the catastrophic mechanism described in ancient texts. The nanodiamonds, iridium anomalies, shocked quartz, and carbon spherules found in boundary sediments worldwide document cosmic impact of sufficient magnitude to generate the atmospheric disturbances, climate disruption, and hydrological catastrophe described in flood narratives. The mass extinctions, rapid climate change, and environmental upheaval documented in the geological record correspond precisely with conditions that would destroy advanced civilizations, while enabling small numbers of prepared survivors to preserve essential knowledge and rebuild. The pattern revealed by this evidence suggests that human civilizational development follows cyclical rather than linear trajectories, with periods of advancement interrupted by catastrophic events that require rebuilding from preserved knowledge. Understanding this cyclical pattern carries profound implications for contemporary civilization facing comparable existential threats, including climate change, nuclear weapons, pandemics, and cosmic impact risks. The ancient response to catastrophic threat through systematic knowledge preservation, institutional resilience, and careful transmission of essential information across generational and cultural boundaries offers practical models that modern society might adapt for ensuring survival of human achievements through potential future disruptions. The Eridu Genesis ultimately preserves not merely an account of ancient catastrophe, but practical wisdom regarding how human civilization can survive existential challenges through preparation, preservation, and systematic knowledge transmission. Recognizing the historical validity of this ancient text and others, like it may prove essential for developing the resilience necessary to ensure that contemporary human achievements survive to benefit future generations. Regardless of what catastrophes the future may hold, the choice between dismissing these accounts as primitive mythology or learning from humanity's accumulated experience with civilizational survival may determine whether our current cycle of advancement continues or suffers the same catastrophic reset that the Eridu Genesis so precisely documents.